Hi, this is Richard Vague with Tycos. Is Social Security going bankrupt? That's been the refrain from politicians and policymakers for as long as I can remember. And it comes up in campaigns as some posture themselves as saviors and defenders of Social Security, while others posture themselves as the brave ones willing to make the tough decisions to reform Social Security and save America from fiscal calamity. Social Security is actually a pretty simple retirement payment system. It's funded by tax on payrolls, and it starts paying out retirement income at or after the normal retirement age of 62. Decades ago, when the American population was younger, proportionally more of its citizens were paying into the fund, and proportionally fewer were retired and receiving benefits. In 1950, the median age of the country was 29 years old, and today it's 38. So today, proportionally fewer folks are paying into the fund, and proportionally more are retired and taking out of the fund. That aging meant that inevitably payouts would come to exceed tax revenue, and that's now happened. And since Americans have long been having fewer babies, the problem will continue to gradually get worse. Let's take a look. Here's the income and expense from 1950 forward, and you can see that whereas income used to exceed expense or withdrawals by a bit, expense began to exceed income in 2021, and in 2022, that negative gap or deficit was $22 billion. Now let's look at a forecast that takes that forward 10 years into the future. This is a forecast provided by the Social Security Administration itself. It's somewhat pessimistic and shows the annual deficit growing to a ghastly $400 billion by 2030. The total money in the Social Security Fund itself reached a peak of $2.9 trillion in 2020, gradually building up over time, but with the deficits we now have, it is now shrinking. The fund total is the accumulated amount of annual surpluses since the program's inception, but now those surpluses have turned negative. This particular forecast actually shows the fund running out of cash by 2032. There are less dire forecasts than this, but not by much, so let's use this one. The Social Security Trust Fund is something of an odd duck. It is not at all managed or accounted for as a pension, as you might have expected. In fact, you can almost think of the Social Security system as a pay-as-you-go system, with the trust funding having acted as a buffer for those deficits that have now arrived. Frankly, if legislators were willing, it could easily operate on a pay-as-you-go basis going forward without relying on a trust fund whatsoever. In that case, the annual Social Security deficit would simply add to the government's overall deficit we are all so familiar with, and be funded by the issuance of conventional government treasury bonds. Now let's look at the total liability implied by our Social Security deficit, a total that some analysts believe should be added to the conventional government total debt of $36 trillion to give us the true total picture of U.S. government debt. To calculate that number, they take the projected annual Social Security deficit over several decades and compute the present value of that future deficit. The Social Security Administration itself has calculated this, the present value of unfunded obligations, as being $22.6 trillion through 2098. So if you use that number, then the total government debt would be the $36 trillion in conventional government debt we all are very familiar with, plus this $22.6 trillion of debt equivalent Social Security liability. And that would give us an overall debt total of $58.6 trillion in the current year of 2025. That's shocking, right? This $22.6 trillion Social Security liability total depends on the assumptions a given analyst would make regarding mortality rates, birth rates, retirement rates, dates, interest rates, and small changes in these assumptions over this many decades make big differences in this projected liability. So you perhaps won't be surprised that different analysts have made very different estimates of Social Security liability. And though the Social Security Administration calculates that amount as $22.6 trillion, if you were to tell us that you thought the Social Security liability were as high as 30 trillion or 40 trillion or 60 trillion or as low as 10 trillion, we wouldn't spend any time trying to disagree with you. But let's keep it at 22.6 trillion for this exercise and take a look at the implications. As mentioned, we first take our 36 trillion in conventional government debt and add the 22.6 trillion in Social Security liability for the total we've already mentioned of 58.6 trillion. Now, luckily, the government holds some assets, $11 trillion worth in the form of such things as buildings and student loans. So we need to add those as a positive in the net worth calculation. And when we do, we show that the government's net worth, its assets minus liabilities, including the adverse impact of Social Security liability, is negative $47 trillion. Again, a shocking number. However, to look only at the government's debt and net worth is a very incomplete and misleading approach. Because when the U.S. government spends money, that money doesn't disappear. That money largely goes into the checking accounts of U.S. households. The net worth of U.S. households in 2024, cash plus real estate plus stocks and a few other assets, was $170 trillion, towering over the negative net worth of the government. Here's a key point. Liabilities have to be matched with assets. So if we show this Social Security liability as a debt of the government, we have to also show the matching asset, which is the Social Security benefit due households. In other words, the $22.6 trillion in Social Security liability to the government is matched by the addition of $22.6 trillion in assets on the balance sheet of U.S. households. That adds $22.6 trillion to their $170.9 trillion in net worth to give U.S. households a grand total of $193.5 trillion in total net worth. As an aside, a disproportionately greater part of this goes to lower income households, which has the effect of lessening the otherwise large wealth gap in the U.S. So now that we have all that in front of us, let's try and solve our Social Security deficit problem. An easy way to do that would simply be to raise the payroll tax from its current level of 12.4% to 16.2%. That instantly solves the entire problem, but it reduces the average worker's take-home pay by around $2,400 a year, so has never been seriously considered by lawmakers. Any proposed fix to Social Security is a lightning rod for political controversy, but there are two solutions to the Social Security deficit that are at least widely discussed and considered, and are at least somewhat more legislatively feasible. The first one is perhaps the easier of the two to consider. Currently, the Social Security tax is not assessed on any income over $176,100. That doesn't seem very fair, at least to some, especially since over time inflation has resulted in so many more salaries increasing to above that level. So one easy proposed solution would be to tax salaries above a certain level, and the analysis the Social Security Administration does is over $250,000 at that 12.4% rate without changing anything on the benefit side. And according to the Social Security Administration, that solves 66% of our problem. However, this widely discussed proposal will leave a gap between the two income levels, $176.1 thousand and $250,000, known as the donut hole, where income will remain untaxed. Presumably, you'd fix that by lowering it to $176 trillion, but that's not the analysis the Social Security Administration did. The second solution is more controversial. It would be to gradually increase the normal retirement age by 1 month every 2 years, beginning with those turning age 62 in 2025 until it reaches 68. The logic here is that the average lifespan is so much greater now than when Social Security was first enacted almost 100 years ago. This proposal would close approximately 12% of the actuarial shortfall, providing a modest contribution towards long-term sustainability without imposing immediate additional financial burdens on workers. Add these two proposed changes together and we've solved 78% of the problem. Let's look again at the forecasted deficit. With these changes, it would be 78% smaller, which means in 2030, the forecasted deficit would only be about $90 billion instead of the $400 billion we mentioned earlier. Not bad, eh? Now let's look at the government's implied Social Security liability or debt, which as mentioned is $22.6 trillion. With these changes, it shrinks all the way down to $5 trillion. Not bad. And accordingly, the government's net worth improves to negative $29.6 trillion. And if the government's Social Security liability shrinks from $22.6 trillion to $5 trillion, a reduction of $17.6 trillion, then household net worth shrinks by that $17.6 trillion from $193.5 trillion to $175.8 trillion. Households will thus be less well off over time. Are you perhaps feeling a little better now? This all shows there is a path to addressing our so-called Social Security crisis. And frankly, we have to believe that when the moment comes, legislators will act to address this one way or the other. But look what happens to household net income if we impose the tax on incomes over $250,000 and increase the age of eligibility. If the government's Social Security deficit shrinks from $400 billion to $90 billion in 2030, a reduction of $300 billion, that means household income will be reduced by that exact amount through increased taxation and reduced payouts. We can make these changes to Social Security, but we have to keep in mind that an expense reduction for the government will be matched by income reduction for households, and a reduction in the government's liabilities will be matched by a reduction in household net worth. The bottom line is that we believe the Social Security deficit will be successfully addressed by hook and by crook without much, if any, adverse impact to current recipients when the moment comes. That's it for this week. Thanks.